Right.
Yeah, I'm okay to introduce myself. So I'm Tom Moore. I'm a PhD student at Sheffield School of Architecture. And my PhD looks at using the city as a place for learning. The concept that I use is civic education. But the kind of main case study of my research is where we're stood now, not in this book, but the area of Castlegate. So welcome to my world, I guess. It's been my world since 2016. So as Florian was saying, these projects take time. Sometimes I feel like I've still not got anywhere. But hey ho. And there's two things I wanted to talk about today. The first one being the Urban Commons Handbook, which is a publication which, again, I've been working on for 3 years with the Urban Commons Research Collective, which is a number of PhD students at Sheffield School of Architecture, all supervised by Donna Petrescu and Beatrice Vicali, who are two kind of really prominent researchers in this area. Next slide, please. In the Urban Commons Handbook, I wanted to talk to you about this, not necessarily because to like advertise its content, but to show you an interesting way of like doing research in a kind of decentralised and relational way. As we say, this was done like over a pandemic, looking like it might be done like through a world war. So we kind of joke that this is the only thing that's kind of sustains while the world's kind of eroding around us. And it was put together by kind of 9 different researchers. And I'll come to kind of start by kind of denouncing my kind of expertise. And I think that's interesting because I started this process not knowing anything about Urban Commons or Commons, and really kind of used it as a way to kind of learn about a new way of practicing and a new way of being in the city, along with lots of my colleagues. So I'll talk about this first, and then next slide, please. And then I'll talk about my own research, which tries to situate that learning about commons in the city of Sheffield, in the space that we're stood. This is a drawing from my research, which just talks about some of the ideas about making education across the city, but I'll talk about it through 2 different case studies, one being an example of commons in Sheffield, which has kind of been established, started as a kind of latent commons from the nesters that Lewis was talking about earlier, and through kind of architectural intervention has become kind of successful commons. And then I'll talk about a kind of more latent commons, which is the project of this piece of city, of Castlegate, kind of my involvement with that. So all of this is coming from a position of what can the kind of architect's role be in this understanding of commons being a community of people coming together, a shared resource, of something which is kind of collectively owned, and then a process of commoning, which is deliberately averred, which kind of iteratively finds out what the kind of rules of governance are of that community and that kind of shared resource. So sometimes they're kind of very spatial commons, but then sometimes it can be something like knowledge as the shared resource. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to talk about the process of putting this together, it was done through a series of workshops, talks, and sessions that we organised, much like you're doing now. Next slide. This is the kind of network of the Urban Commons Research Collective. So in this inner ring here is all of us, but then we were kind of attached to these different practices. So I'm attached to a practice called Live Works. There's Julie Udall, who's attached to Studio Pulpo, who we talked a lot about today. But then there's internationally lots of different researchers and practitioners, for example, from Cyprus, from Romania, from Paris, and Petrescu, who talked about just then, La Foresta in Italy, and another project in Italy. So in all of the projects that we looked at, we tried to kind of connect something from our own practice that we know ourselves, and if we haven't done, we've kind of partnered with the organisation that runs that commons to try and better understand what they're doing. Next slide, please. So the handbook, let's see, was kind of organised around 7 different strands of ways to understand this idea of commons. So we've got economies, ecologies, knowledges, localities, socialities, and infrastructures. So trying to kind of understand this very kind of broad topic of commons by lots of different practices that make that up. And for every different strands that we've looked at, there's a story that's associated with that that tries to kind of demonstrate that understanding. Next slide. And we did this again through a series of workshops that tried to map the text, projects and practices in kind of collaborative mapping sessions with people like ourselves, people from universities, to try and draw an archive, a living archive together of all the kind of commons practices, both kind of academically and in practice, happening across the world, or certainly across Europe. Next slide, please. So, for example, one of these events was an event at Central St Martin's, where we gave a talk and then had a kind of collaborative mapping session with students from Central St Martin's to try and understand the text, practices and projects that they knew about Commony. So as well as the kind of collaborative network within ourselves, we've always trying to kind of broaden that out to a kind of wider public. Next slide, please. A series of seminars from experts in the fields, like yourselves. So again, this process that you're putting yourselves through is kind of mirroring that process that we did ourselves. Next slides. And then there was this kind of system of bringing all this together, which tries to start to bridge our quite kind of academic work with the work of practice. And this was done through a kind of index of tags or concepts or keywords, which kind of create a commonality between the different strands, but also create a way for kind of students and practitioners to navigate all the different texts and kind of take learning from concepts such as kind of ethics of care, such as conviviality, such as infrastructuring, and create a kind of recipe book for people to take these academic concepts and kind of use them in their own practice. Next slide. So these are the strands as you can actually see them. Next slide. I'll just very quickly run through these, but infrastructures is again about using this verbiage of kind of infrastructuring, which are about making the kind of physical tools of commons, which I guess you'll be quite familiar with in terms of creating spaces for event and for people to, and for the communities of commoning to come together and support their process of commoning. Next slide. And the story that's kind of accompanied by that is La Foresta in the Alps in Italy, which is a kind of rural setting which creates a kind of support network for grassroots communities through self-building workshops to support their kind of grassroots community organisations. Next slide. Ecology is looking at how urban commons contributes to ecological repair, introducing this concept of eco-commoning. Next slide. An example which illustrates that is AgroCity are urban. So Florian talks about this, so I'll just touch on it really quickly. One of the really interesting things about this is that, talking about that idea of longevity, is that this is the original site of AgroCity. And the local council decided they wanted to turn this ground into a car park, so they levelled it off. But because the way that the kind of processes of commoning and the community have been looked after by the architects, but by the others and by themselves, and the way that they managed to find ways to work together, they were kind of inspired to start a campaign of civic action, which ultimately got AgroCity moved to a different place. So yeah, again, when you're talking about that longevity, it can be about instilling the kind of political awareness and the political knowledge of how to have impact in a city can kind of create that longevity beyond a specific site and a specific building. Next slide. Localities, so talking about how urban commons are situated in the particular places that they exist and how they respond to the particular needs of communities that they work with. But then also looking at this idea of translocality. So how can different urban commons create networks which transcend a particular place and create networks of knowledge sharing, of tool sharing, and story sharing. So next slide. The example of this is hands-on Famagusta, which is in Cyprus. Cyprus being a heavily contested place, which in the northern side being Turkish owned, the southern side being Greek owned, and in the middle there's this demilitarized zone where everybody is being kind of like turfed outside of their houses. And this project was to make that kind of interstitial zone in Cyprus a place of commoning and a place of coming together between Greek nationalists and Turkish nationalists. So talking about some of the kind of contestations, translations, disputes that come with specific localities and their issues. Next slide. Knowledge is talking about how knowledge itself can be a resource for commoning, but then also the knowledge that's created through processes of kind of spatial commoning. Next slide. An example that goes with this is the City School in Romania, and this works with the kind of social housing units in post-Soviet Bucharest, where the designer and architect Alex Lazinti worked with the libraries that exist in these kind of downfall places of post-socialist housing to kind of create thresholds for communities to get more involved in that library space. So again, creating a kind of wider community for longevity of these kind of community assets. Next slide. Socialities, the kind of ways and means by which people kind of interact with each other and create these kind of communities of commoning, as well as the processes of commoning themselves. Next slide. And the interesting example from this is the intersectional Stadthaus, which I guess is quite similar to the space that we're existing in today. But it's a house in Vienna which is collectively owned by people from the disabled community in Vienna, the disabled and queer community in Vienna. What's quite interesting about this is that underneath in the basement of this, there's a community of neo-Nazis. And the kind of conflicts and contestations which happen between these two communities because of the place that it's situated, and the kind of change in this part of the city because of where it's situated and the practices that these collectively start to bring together. Next slide. And then finally, governance. The codes by which commons kind of protect themselves, you know, as was I've forgotten the name, so I'll skip over that. But as I was saying, that kind of third part of commoning, those processes of common, how can you make them kind of replicable and repeatable? So as Florian was saying, you know, talking about scaling up, so that not every process of commoning is a kind of grassroots, always starting again. How can you create common codes which allow people to kind of transcend specific commons? So next slide. And the example here is the Asilo Ferrandieri, which took over a heritage building and found their own ways of kind of governing themselves and each other and their building. Next slide. So this one I'm going to use to zoom in on Sheffield. The example that goes with this before I go back to the definition is Portland Works, which is a post Nestors Works in Sheffield that Lou is introducing. And the ideas around why this story is interesting, because it the designers' involvement was very much about making what are called diverse economies visible in this particular part of the city, to kind of make a counter narrative that was made by the developer, the owner of this particular building, to turn these houses into apartments because the building was empty, it was disused, it was derelict. The designers went through a process of making visible the diverse economies that were existing in this building, to show it to the council as a place that was successful and thriving, and ultimately we were able to purchase that building as a community. So next slide. Sorry, quickly, next one. That's the book. I don't need to talk about that. Next slide. But this is interesting. So this is that kind of index of tags. This is all those kind of useful concepts that are useful for bridging kind of theory and practice. And I'll use some of these, particularly in the economies strands, to talk about the case studies and try to understand what kind of processes and practices have been used by the designers, but also the community of the practice themselves. Next slide. So this should be a video which I'll talk over a little bit. Yeah, so Louis kind of gave a background to the Masters in Sheffield. Common in Sheffield, because they were kind of individually skilled makers and craftsmen who came together as a community around a shared resource of, they might have a central furnace, a central courtyard, a central place where they could kind of share their skills across the community and create those modes of governing and those modes of commoning between each other. So I put the tag of commoning here as it talks about them kind of creating those relations of interdependence between humans and non-humans. So we're not just talking about the relationship between the different craftsmen, but also the relationship between the craftsmen and the machines, the craftsmen and the kind of collectively owned furnace, the craftsmen and the building who need to repair their building to allow it to kind of function. And this video is of a particular craftsman called a putter or a putterer, who is in charge of putting the scissors together, which have gone through all the other processes of manufacturing. Just to give you an idea of the kind of level of craft that is kind of going into this process. And at the time, this particular craftsman was working out of Portland Works. It doesn't kind of anymore. I can skip one. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this I used to give this to you guys to see it. Yeah. It's just. So yeah, this particular Master's Works, Portland Works, is one of the kind of last remaining examples of a Master's Works in Sheffield, and is kind of over near the Sheffield United Football Stadium. Anyone who knows where that is, but what was interesting about these Master's Works is that a lot of other cities, a lot of other industries would put their kind of large industrial steelworks on the edges of the city, whereas Master's Works, because of their kind of small scale nature, kind of allowed them to be in the city centre itself. So it made Sheffield this place that was kind of pumping of activity, of industrial activity constantly. And this one has kind of fallen into disrepair, and is no longer kind of exclusively a Mester's works, but there are still what would once be called Mesters existing in this building. So cutlery makers, scissor craftsmen, but then also artists exist in this building, distilleries, brewers, and other makers of musicians, other makers of kind of non-industrial backgrounds. And what's interesting about this, it created this kind of processes of care for this building, where this community was investing back into this building, and kind of wanting to go through this process of repair and investing kind of their own livelihoods into this space, despite not owning it themselves. Skip over. So, for example, the owners in this building can't necessarily see it very well, but this is the kind of system of post boxes for the building, which is something that the community came together, and in that same way as Lou was talking about the Mesters, finding the different parts of the processes that needed to be done. You know, the artists made signage, typography, the metal workers produced the kind of letterboxes themselves. So this kind of modern process of the division of labour being a kind of productive commoning process very much came to the fruition in this act of relationality, which was giving people a place to kind of message each other. So next slide. And what's interesting about this is, although inside of the building all of this interesting work was happening with the relationality between artists, metal workers, musicians, from the outside of the building, all of this value that existed inside was invisible. To the market-based economy, all of this work to find ways of working together, of making a space productive, just making do, is very much not recognised by the market economy. So much so that when the owner of the building submitted a planning application to turn this building into flats, it was kind of very easy for them to make the claim that this building was completely empty, it was derelict, it was not being used. But as a kind of way to develop the counter-narrative to this, Studio Pulpo and Julie Udall, who's a colleague and fellow researcher, started the processes of making visible all of the kind of invisible value that was going on in the building. So, for example, they created these posters which told the story of each of the makers which existed in this building and made them kind of part of the facade. And although this is a very kind of small gesture, it kickstarted the process of kind of continually making visible through kind of open days, exhibitions and events. So next slide, please. They also kind of went through a process of mapping of all of the different kind of diverse economies. So diverse economies being all these things that aren't recognised by the kind of traditional market economy. So, for example, the economies that exist in the home, economies that might exist between, you know, a community that might not have a washing machine as a community, that all of the families in that community might have a washing machine, so that they kind of pass around the washing between themselves. So that, in a way, is a diverse economy of kind of care, of collective care. But again, the value of that wouldn't be recognised by the market economy. So this was then trying to map all of that kind of net worth of the diverse economies and make it visible to the council and to the kind of decision makers. Next slide, please. And yeah, this idea of reproductive labour being part of a diverse economy. So this was a process that we went through, as I said before, of opening up the building, of making the building visible, of of celebrating the makers within it, but also the building as a heritage asset itself. And what this allows the kind of the already existing community of makers, it allowed them to expand their community, who were kind of caring for their collective resource. So as kind of designers who are kind of event organisers, we can think about the ways that we use event to kind of expand the community of commoning, as well as the kind of infrastructure that is used for commoning. Next slides. And ultimately, what was really interesting is that through this process of building their community of commoners, the building was ultimately able to be purchased by a community land trust, where 300 occupants of the local community came together and purchased the building. But what was quite interesting here is that all of a sudden, when the building was being valued by the estate agents, for example, to set the amount of money that needed to be brought together to purchase the building, all of a sudden, the value that had been ignored and lost and undervalued was built into the valuation of the building. So the estate agent said that the building was worth nothing, but the processes which existed within it were worth 400,000. So the community of commoners were made to pay 400,000 for their own work, but paid nothing for the building. Essentially. So yeah, it's interesting the kind of interplay between how the market can very easily ignore something, but then all of a sudden, when it is brought back into the market, these kind of processes of commoning can be valued. And it just goes to show that with the right methods, the kind of economies which exist within, mutual economies, which exist within commoning, can be held to have value in spheres like local councils, in spheres like local decision makers, even national decision makers. So when we're talking about, again, how to scale up this activity, how can we as designers kind of appropriate mechanisms of the market in this occasion to our detriment, but how might we do that in the reverse to bring value to commoning processes? Next slide, please. Yeah, so again, bringing in this idea of actionable knowledge. Knowledge is a process of commoning. So as well as creating value by making visible the processes, they also has a series of workshops to build skills amongst the community of commoners on how to collectively manage parts of their building, on how to develop community land trusts, on how to develop a strategy of repair, but then also how to kind of collectively make decisions for the benefit of the commons. So again, all this knowledge that was generated becomes part of the kind of common resource. Next slide. So then, just to kind of tie up the story of Portland Works, Portland Works went from the kind of industrial tools of the industrial age being a latent commons between craftsmen. It's dangerous work, nobody's saying it's perfect. But moved from this mode of tool making to what Ivan Illich would call convivial tools. And his ideas on kind of conviviality and deschooling and moving away from institutions were almost a kind of precursor to thinking on commons and how what might be the kind of role of experts who have kind of developed expertise through commoning processes. So how can we develop tools which can help kind of multiple commons and allow, maybe even form new kinds of institutions around urban common. So next slide. Yeah. So then I'll move on to thinking about a commons which doesn't yet exist, but is a kind of challenge to EASA to think, how can this exist as a commons? I think this is a video.
It is.
Yeah. So this is just to kind of introduce the project. No sound.
Oh, the sound of it. I'm sorry.
Again, and so the story of the place is a really important ingredient. In 2014, Sheffield's markets were demolished, leaving behind a material and social void in the centre of the city. But this revealed the site of Sheffield's castle for the first time in more than a century, kick-starting a process of civic engagement with the city's heritage and stories via groups such as the Friends of Sheffield Castle.
We worked with the Friends on a project called Revealing the Castle, which was to capture a vision of incremental development, to really start with what was there, not to just think of it as a blank slate that you just then put something on top of, but you actually start to reveal and sort of build forward from that point. And so the idea was to, over time, activate the site through festivals and markets and creative activities.
Gradually bring it back to life.
In 2017, news stories began to be told on the site as cultural innovators began to move into the peripheries of Castlegate, getting people back into the area and prototyping new activities for its future. From championing marginalised musicians, supporting creative ex-offenders and instilling a DIY ethic to Sheffield's music scene.
After the market was ripped out, it's literally been left to just on its own, like, you know, and there's discount stores and betting shops.
I think there's like quite a slow shift towards this not feeling like not a nice place to be. And I think that, you know, activity in the street, like skateboarding, for instance, or, you know, gigs happening in the evening, or, you know, just generally when all three places on this street are open, like there's a real like buzz to it. Like,
but I guess the risk was, you know, like just putting a lot of time and effort and investment into a project that you think it's ultimately privately owned and it's in an area of town that is earmarked for development, and you just don't know how fast that's.
Although we're lucky enough to have had the space and had, you know, had those conversations and been in sort of a street where there's like exciting stuff happening, how many more people aren't even able to find that space in the first place?
It's about allowing that space to exist for people that can deliver creatively, you know, because young people are fluid, right? So you're kind of coming to the table, you're doing all the kind of, you know, the background and the theory behind it all, which is great. But then actually, you know, what happens is you start breaking things and you start thinking, well, I can't do it. That's where the best things happen, right? So having that synergy with the university is so important, because actually it kind of lends itself well with what we do here. There's a long-term vision. There's an educated approach to what you're doing. The fact that you're sat here talking to us, you know, you're talking to all different parties, irrespective of what they are, how much they've got in the bank, or, you know, it's a totally creative process that you're doing. It's you know.
Castlegate is in some ways.
No, you can't see that at all. So that's the textile side with the layers of history overlaid on top. This idea that in the same way that Portland works as a space that needed to be cared for, this is the space that needs to be cared for. So how can we create a community of commons around this site or around the margins of the site, who are kind of able to do that, but then also how can we support that community of commons so it's not just left to them to kind of invest in their own time, you know, as they were talking about in the video, for them not to be kind of taken advantage of and then to invest all the money in, and then a developer come along once the property price has risen and benefit from all that work. So as well as care for the place, how do we care for the people? That's what the old markets used to look like. Next slide. So I started working on the site in 2016, and the first thing that we did on the site as a group of students, much as you've done today, was be allowed onto the site for the first time. So we were the first people to be allowed onto it after it was demolished in 2014. And instead of kind of surveying the site with kind of tape measures or kind of traditional architectural methods, we decided to do it through this kind of relational, performative methods, where we traced the area of the castle boundaries and invited people to kind of join us in this performance. And this kind of kickstarted a way of working, a method of working for myself and others around a kind of relational architecture practice and kind of bringing people together. Next slides. So this was a kind of very early diagram that I did of kind of this way of working, of having a kind of central table of kind of core team where we kind of brought in and plugged in expertise from elsewhere. And then this eventually became the proposition of a collective called the Castlegate Collective, which was a group of people who had the capability to realise visions, to do work on the ground. And then this later became the Exchange Street Collective, who were the guys who did the Castlegate Festival in the video. Next slide. And the kind of vision that was created as part of that kind of very early project in 2016 was not about kind of announcing a vision of the site and saying this is what the site should be. It was about creating a story of how that site would or could be developed through time, along with the Castlegate Collective. So speaking with people such as CADS who rent out creative art space and saying, you know, what could you do in this space? What do you need to do that? We need access down to here, and we need a yes from the council. So then that became part of the strategy that existed in time. So we had like 30 drawings total. We're going from a complete empty site as a scenario, what that could mean through to the present day. So next slide. And then what's kind of quite interesting about this way of working, and that's kind of has come up as a theme throughout the day, is that while the site itself has kind of to a certain extent remained static, the kind of thresholds of the site, all the stuff around the site, has started to become populated, has started to kind of create interesting things, being filled with makers, cultural entrepreneurs, and in a way has become a form of latent commons. It's become a kind of version of Portland Works on a kind of wider scale. Next slide. So this, for example, was worked with the group of artists in Exchange Place Studios, who were pointed out as being kind of over there. And this was a kind of initial idea to kind of capture the kind of thoughts and feelings around the Castlegate area through a kind of scrap modelling exercise, which invited people to kind of have their say on this area of the city, and also collect stories and memories of this part of the city as a way of kind of engaging people. Next slide. And then, as I talked about Exchange Street, so how could we imagine Exchange Street and the kind of the shop units in this space as a kind of potential or latent commons? The ownership around this building is very kind of disputed, where the building itself is owned by a kind of private developer who owns Wilco's. 2 years ago, the council had an opportunity to purchase this building, but something happened, which Simon Ogden might have alluded to with whispers in people's ears, that the money that existed wasn't used to purchase this building. So that it's in those kind of cultural entrepreneurs are put in a precarious situation where they could potentially put a lot of investment into these spaces. You know, anyone moving in alongside them could put a lot of investment into these spaces, the property prices rise, and then ultimately sold on. So how can you use design to advocate to the council that this building should be purchased, that should be central to the development of this area, the pioneers who existed in these spaces and the first ones to move into Castlegate, how can they be valued? How should they be valued in the kind of ongoing development of this area of the city? Next slide. And then looking a bit further afield about kind of different kinds of communities who don't look like me. So this is an image from SADACA, which is the Sheffield and District, Sheffield and District African and Caribbean Community Association, which is on the Wicker, which is just down there. And they've existed in that space since the 1980s, providing kind of care for the African Caribbean community of Sheffield, but then also a place to kind of celebrate their culture. They exist in an old steelworks, and very recently they've started the process of turning this building from a completely derelict old steel mill into a kind of possible event space. And they want to use that event space for kind of African food markets, for celebrations and exhibitions of what they call the Bantu Archive, which is a what we would probably understand as a kind of Black History Archive of Sheffield, as a way of kind of celebrating the histories and voices of African and Caribbean immigrants coming into the Sheffield for the first time, and also a kind of productive force for the future, an ongoing archive, which continues to make stories of African and Caribbean culture in Sheffield. So if I just kind of go off piece for a second and try to tie some of this up, this kind of work on the margins, I think the council's agenda for this part of the city, as I understand at the moment, is to create this hub of innovation. And what they mean by innovation is often kind of bringing in kind of well-established innovator, such as kind of Google, Amazon, a big kind of employer to the city as a kind of epicenter for innovation. And what I'm interested in doing is going through a process of revealing the innovation which already exists in the city, and uses that as a kind of basis for urban development, and to create a counter narrative of this part of the city being a commons, ultimately. So next slide. Next slides. So what's interesting again about all this, again going back to what Simon Ogden said about the council being ordered £20 million to renovate this area. Myself and my practice, LiveWorks, have been commissioned by the council to develop a co-production strategy to deliver the 20 million. And what we found is interesting is that we're always one step ahead of the council. So that anything that, because we started off thinking, you know, they already have a plan, they won't really listen to us, they're just going to get us in a room, talk with people, and then they won't listen to it and they won't take it forward. But actually, because of the way that the council is shifting and changing, you know, the kind of resignations, they're really behind in their goal to get this done by 2024. So there's a real opportunity to kind of beat the council to the punch and say, we're going to make this a process which is really about co-production, which is really about giving people ownership or power to have an effect in different parts of the community. So the process that we're going through is 4 different processes of revealing, where we're inviting different community organisations across Sheffield. Simon would advocate to someone like me that it needs to be an open public engagement to get people discussing the plans for this area of the city. My argument is that if you make it open and public, you always get the same kind of people coming to discuss it. So our agenda is that it needs to be targeted kind of invited sessions where people like SADACA have a place in those meetings to kind of come along and get involved. So all of these sessions were about kind of revealing what's already there and then working with those people to establish, okay, what is the brief? What is the next part of the process that needs that to happen? And I'm quite excited to think that this kind of co-aligns with 2023 event for you guys. Is that, you know, by the time that we get to that, we'll have like this co-developed brief with these communities that we're working with. What's the crossover that could we do something there to establish this part of Sheffield as, you know, the Sheffield Commons? You know, it's massive, but why not? So yeah, that's my challenge to us all. I didn't pose any questions, but I guess just
yeah, should we do it?
Yeah,
I feel like there's so much to
yeah.
chew on there. Does anyone want to kick us off? Come on. Go, Jim. You have to kick us off.
I just feel like I'm always kicking off.
Well, no,
I'm just like,
we're just going to get a trickle started somehow.
I mean, yeah, it's like, it's super exciting to like, oh, I would do that.
No, hey,
Oh, okay, maybe you'll always say yes, it's strictly sound, but
I will always say.
you'll always say it's strictly sound.
I mean,
Is
if you believe in, you can see what the structure is. If you trust reciprocal.
it? Yeah, I guess it's like, it'd be interesting to,
It wouldn't touch it too much.
it'd be interesting to like start to think about how, yeah, like how we could, like, because this whole process is brief building, right? But for us as well, like how we can engage as well, like in person, and how we can tie that in with what we're doing in our program over the coming year. Because yeah, and maybe that it's like facilitated somehow. Yeah.
I think particularly in thinking that so many of us are from, you know, we're away like Louis in Sheffield full time, but we're elsewhere in Belfast as well. How we make that community that is here, show that we are like, to show that we're making.
So I think what's important for you guys is you don't necessarily come in and think you have to like solve everything. Just going back to Maureen's presentation, like the kind of critical work that was being done out in the city, I think also like adds real value. So while it might not be like you have to like deliver the biggest urban commons in the world, it should be like, what is there like a part of the process, challenge that you could engage with, that could be tested, in a kind of in a 2-week session.
It's also the kind of like idea of a long-term infrastructure for mutual education as well. So, for example, is it about creating a bit of the, maybe one spaces or something like that allows with EASA or kind of like continued engagement post event and things like that. And there was a really great lecture by Fran yesterday that she mentioned that one of their projects, one of the projects she really visited in Epping Forest just had an open door, and they just had an open door policy for like 60 years, and the people, artists and people just pleasure. Anyway, I thought it was really, one of the interesting things I thought you said, and it's something that I believe too, which is often contested, which is this idea of having an open, completely open consultation process and something that's one-on-one or kind of has selective interviews and things like that. Like I definitely feel like I'm a kind of that approach as well, because I see that like the way you kind of do participatory decision making and things like that, you know, you can kind of like if you just create a big learning process, just a way that people are like most vocal and also probably least engaged in real terms in many cases, you know, and it's actually like getting under the skin of that. There's a lot of stuff read in the book by Long Looked Out that talks about one-on-one interviews being key. Yeah, so that's a kind of, I think that's a really great thing, and there's a way. I'd love to share some stuff that like some research I've done on down the past with you in the future. Yeah, just about how kind of moved on that kind of process. But yeah, that was really interesting. That's a really like quite a daring and also a very valid point in terms of like the practice of social architecture, like how, you know, the image of creating a consultation, like what does it look like? Is it actually just one-on-one conversations, which doesn't get the same like snapshot, like 100,000 people in the circle, you know? But maybe doing that rigor like over 4 or 5 months or something, just getting to know every single person is a way. So yeah, I think that my thoughts are just that like, yeah, it sounds incredible, and it's just about working out how EASA can like. So just to give you a bit of a framework, obviously the way EASA works is with community. The event tends to be a lot of different workshops. So it might be a case of like, you know, co-developing a series of like briefs or things that are challenges that people might actually kind of start to relate to when they're proposing workshops, or might actually kind of like tap into it. So that often what might happen is engage with the city or engage with the place, do some background research, but they're not actually always relating to the users of the space. They might actually just have, you know, kind of another idea that they want to progress, which is really good. And there's definitely maybe a further EASA, which is always going to be a space for that. But maybe there's a kind of like way we can integrate like or understand what the needs of people are more clearly, and then kind of start to think, well, if there are proposals, workshop proposals, can we weight them against the merits of things, and if there are lots of people give us a framework.
Just like
Build into it, you know?
there's a kind of initial thought, like from speaking to the guys on Exchange Street, the kind of ongoing problem they have is around noise, and like not necessarily that they're making noise, the perception of their noise, the being like kind of late night openers in what is going to become a residential area, probably like realistically there's going to be people living around them. So they're really scared that all of a sudden, you know, 200 apartments are going to be built right in front of their shop, and then all of a sudden they can't make any noise like whatsoever. And sorry, where was it going with this? So the idea of like, how can you protect their ability to make noise, or how can you even like celebrate noise in the city as something that should be valued, and not something that's just like one person has made a complaint so that they can't get the fence license for 5 years because one guy living in a flat where it's even been acoustically tested but you can't hear it makes a complaint, so it gets delayed for
yeah, but I guess there's perceptual stuff in what idea of culture as well, like the music culture being, but and it's awareness of that from the council as well. Like you might have busybodies, and they might not always be right. Like, you know, it's not always the guys, and if they're working with them and they have a big strong relationship with them, they know what they're actually like and what they're likely to do. And maybe it's just like a framework for dealing with nice places. Like, you know, people might not tell the truth. Like they might just not want bands there because they don't like them. They're a bit stuffy or something.
that's the people that you don't want that kind of people.
Yeah, exactly. It's really like that with skateboard communities as well. It's like always, it's always a bit. Sorry, there's someone trying to.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to grab them.
Yeah, something was going to come out on that, on the brains and stuff.
Suppose the interesting question that I'm always kind of wrestling with in my research is like, I'm a designer, so what? Like, what value can I offer as a designer, as a spatial practitioner, whatever that means. And it's not something that I figured out, but hopefully through doing kind of research, I will kind of start to understand. And I'm sure it will be the same for you guys, and what will help you do as designers to have longevity, to not just kind of drop into a place, do something that's nice and move on. It's so difficult.
I think what's interesting from my folklore timeline that he was saying, actually I told me he's gonna say some kind of how information about one of the shorter workshops that said that he something about 12 years collaboration when you're because that you are investigating also for the couple years so I think where does it fit in the two skills here and having all this well or over a year now the need that's there where who can engage in it because some people here whether you are coming here or some people here can do it over this period but there is going to be 600 other people that's going to come here. It's also a question a lot of these people are going to come to designers.
Yeah.
Of course, so much.
But that has value.
Yeah. But I guess I'm wondering if like so much of, or a part of that about regulation, how you deal with things level, and then I guess like trying to get a way to physically most effective things, and then utilize this to read with testing. If maybe there, I mean maybe that is a way.
My instincts, which is obviously biased, would be like, how can you either like attach? It's like recognizing that 2 weeks isn't in isolation. Like as you've already done, like stuff comes before it, stuff comes after it. So that means either attaching to a project which already exists, or being the seed of a project which is going to exist for another 10 years. Because things that are worth doing take 10 years. I think that's probably just finding a good community who invested in, who has passion to work with youth, but also with themselves. I wouldn't be scared by the fact that it's just 2 weeks.
I'd like to add something to what you were talking about earlier about value of these spaces. What value can we add as architects, designers? Because at least from my perception, these urban voids have its value consists on like its ambiguity, yeah, and how they differ from other like public spaces that are so programmed that maybe they're a great public space, but always like a certain community is excluded from them. So I guess like my question, like my worries about how to approach the design of these spaces, like how much do we design? How much is it like opened? Because if you start like drawing like limits, or you're automatically leaving someone out. It's very difficult to have like, I don't know, from my perspective. I was just wondering, how are you planning on like incorporating all of the communities, all of the points of views all of it, so the value is not lost.
Well, I think here it's interesting to go back to that idea of the commons consisting of a community of commons, shared resource, systems of commons, because for it to be a commons, it has to be closed to a certain extent.
Yeah.
It's not like open. So, at a certain extent, you have to kind of make that decision, or somebody has to make that decision of who's going to be involved, who is the kind of community of commons. But what you can do is like what Stavros Stavridis talks about as thresholds, which are like spaces in between the kind of common space and the public, which allow kind of continual refreshment of the membership of the community, but also of the systems of common in, and even the shared resource itself. So yeah, again, I would like, it's a bit of a warning not to like say it has to be kind of open to everybody. There has to be a norm. Like this is a threshold space, right? You've allowed me to come into your common space. For good or bad.
I think, the pub's an interesting idea in that sense, isn't it? Public house, idea of public house.
Yeah, like particularly in the community-owned ones that are like trying to create new community facilities, like for a set number of people. The pub as like a place that anyone can enter, acts like, as you said, is this sort of space that like you kind of can see what's beyond, and like after a few visits you're like allowed access to so much more.
Because in the like I hate to talk too much about academics, but there was this whole thing about the tragedy of the commons, right? The idea if you had an open collective resource, it would just be used to the point of diminishment where it doesn't exist anymore, or it's not valuable anymore. And then Ostrom came along and said, actually, no, that's not true when it has a system of governance. And here are these examples of where it's happened in India, where it has a system of governance and Commons can. So by the act of imposing it to a certain extent protects it as a commons. I don't really know where I'm going with that.
Because maybe it's something that idea of making commons, within this space, like making commons for EASA, but then could kind of like move into kind of a common facility. Bea made this Bea made this really interesting point. There are certain things that like seem to happen over 40 years of these events happening. There seems to be these key like functions, but when you look at them, like we have our thoughts, workshop like toolboxes, like makers facilities. You have the kind of bar area, like dancing and stuff like that. You have accommodation, and you said rightly that they're not just they're things that the needs, but they're actually like weirdly things that multi-use, like they or a thriving community, needs those things really. Like they're so it might be a case of like creating some kind of series of facilities or things like that, but then afterwards start to come, once we start to pull away from that, become like a long-term established set of functions that are on the site that are EASA functions, but they're like just general functions, that they're things that are nice spaces that can be in perpetuity and build a bit of an engine for other things. So say if that is established this and that allows things to be produced there, and utilize them for the future of life work,
I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you for inviting me. It's been a really good day. It's something that I wanted to get involved in for a while. It's good to be here.
All right. Cool.
So we have a break. And then,
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Are we,